Well, the light travel time has been an issue for a long time. I first became aware of it more than 50 years ago when I was just starting college. And it was something that at the time didn't have too many answers to this solution. We have now a number of solutions. They all can't be right. They all could be wrong. I'll share with you my evaluation of what I think is the proper answer to this. And my title slide really illustrates the issue that kind of was touched upon in the Q&A this afternoon. This is an object called NGC 4676. And we believe this object, from its redshift at least, is 300 million light years away, give or take a few. And as you can see, it looks really weird. On the left, it looks like a spiral galaxy, but it's kind of messed up. And the one on the right looks like a spiral galaxy, kind of messed up. And the images suggest there's a strong evidence of an ongoing process, that these things have been interacting as galaxies come close to each other. They kind of mess each other up. It's interesting, when galaxies collide, you might think, well, stars will collide, but the distances between stars are really great. Average distance in the Milky Way between stars is a few light years. So what probably happens is most stars pass through each other and keep going. Now their orbits are perturbed by the mass of the other galaxy. And in recent years, over the last 30 years, they've worked out some nice simulations in 3 dimensions showing the evolution of such the system as they go through what might happen over long periods of time. And it would take many tens of millions of years for this process to take place. So not only are we seeing something that's far away, but we're seeing something that appears to be going with an ongoing process. And I'm not really going to address the second question tonight. I want to address the first question, but I wanted to acknowledge that that problem came up today. Do we posit that God just made these things in mid-interaction as if they started out that way, or did they actually move toward each other at some point? And I don't have a clear answer for that. I think the former, but it does cause me difficulties. So let me define the problem for you as I understand it. We believe that the world was created in 6 normal days, and there are certain textual arguments from Genesis 1 that tell you they're normal days. The best argument I like is the day 1 creation event count. It says there that God said, "Let there be light," and there was light, and God saw it was good. He divided the light from the darkness, and the darkness he called, the light he called, and the light he called day, and the dark he called night, and the evening and the morning were the first day. He just defined, I think I mentioned this yesterday, but it's worth repeating, he just defined what day means. So it would be really peculiar, very poor writing style, and the Holy Spirit is not a poor writer, to use day in two different ways within the same context. And then you look at the genealogies and the chronologies in Scripture, and they give us a target date of about 6,000 years since creation. There's about 2,000 years from creation to Abraham. And there's about 2,000 years from Abraham to Christ. There's about 2,000 years from, we don't get this from Scripture, but from history, from Christ to today. So you get about 6,000 years. I think the date is probably close to 6,200 years, but I'm not going to quibble about that. It's a little over 6,000 years. And we see objects more distant than 6,000 light years. I gave the example of the Andromeda Galaxy, and here's a photo of the Andromeda Galaxy. And I can see this easily enough in a dark sky with my naked eye, with binoculars or telescope. I can see it readily. And so how did the light get here? I mean, it's about 2,994,000 years short, don't you think? Something like that. So it is a problem we need to address. But as you can see in my last point there, the problem isn't really properly formulated. You see, the situation is far worse than that. What do I mean? Well, okay, proper formulation. We have here stars being made on day 4. That is what we think happened, because that's what Scripture says in the day 4 account. Adam was made on day 6. Now I have marked there in the lower left, you see that little purple arrow down there? Right there. On this star chart, it's marking out the position of Alpha Centauri. You can't see it from this latitude because it's a southern star. You have to go to the southern hemisphere, or at least pretty far south in the northern hemisphere to see it. And that is the closest star. Actually, Proxima Centauri is a little closer, but it's a faint star that orbits, we think, around Alpha Centauri. So we'll just call Alpha Centauri the closest. And it's 4.3 light years away from us. So the light you would receive now, if you went out and saw that star, would have left that star probably in the middle of 2019. This is pre-COVID, actually. Pre-COVID-19. So that's a bit of a problem. The question is, did Adam see any stars? He's created on day 6. Eve is created on day 6. Night falls. It's the end of day 6 and beginning of day 7. So for the first time, with human eyes looking up in the sky, assuming it was clear that night, the sky gets dark. And what did Adam and Eve see? Any suggestions from the audience? What did Adam and Eve see that first night?
All the stars you could see.
I think they saw all the stars. In fact, they probably saw something close to what we see today. Why do I think that? Well, on 5 of the 6 days, including the 6th day, it says that God saw that it was good. And at the end of the week, it says God pronounced it very good. And what does that goodness mean? Well, it turns out that goodness refers to completeness. It refers to everything that God made functioning as it was intended, doing what it was supposed to do. And we find that on the day 4 account, the stars had certain purposes along with the sun and the moon. The stars largely provide the background for the sun and the moon, but without them, you don't know where the sun and the moon are in the sky. And in order to fulfill their purposes, the stars had to be visible. And if they weren't visible, then they couldn't fulfill their functions, and God could not pronounce it good, and He certainly could not pronounce it very good. So on the basis of understanding what the goodness of creation is, I understand that Adam and Eve must have seen those stars on the first night of their existence. That is, how did Adam see the closest star? It wasn't like he waited 4 years and say 3 months and then bink one day Alpha Centauri appears. And then a few years later Sirius appears. And after 26 years Vega appears. It didn't happen that way. It happened all at once. So here we are in the 21st century. We're worried about how we could see the most distant objects in the universe, when in reality we should be asking the question, how did Adam see the closest objects in the universe? We're kind of looking at it backwards. If we can solve Adam's light travel time problem, do you think we can solve our light time problem? And I think we can. So I think we need to focus on Adam's problem. If we do, then we can probably fix that. And there's something, talking about fixing, there's something wrong with my PowerPoint, but I don't know what it is. I'm not going to worry about it right now. And there have been several suggested solutions over the years, and I'm going to share that with you, at least a brief summary of those. One of the most common is the first one there, light created in transit, or as they generally preferred, mature creation. The idea is that God did not create Adam as a baby who grew up. The animals the same way. The trees didn't sprout up gradually over many years to form trees. By the time he got finished with the trees on day 3, they were trees. And by the time he got done with the animals on days 5 and 6, they were animals, mature animals, ready to reproduce. And so were Adam and Eve, made as mature things. So following that pattern, the argument is God had to make a mature creation with the light already here. Now, if all we're worried about is seeing lights in the sky, then I think that solution suffices. But there's a problem. I've been doing eclipsing binary research for 45 years. What I study are 2 stars that are in a binary system and they're orbiting around each other. Now the 2 stars are close together and they're far away from us. How close are they? Well, it only takes some of these 6 or 8, 10 hours to orbit each other. These are sun-like stars. It takes the Earth a year to orbit the sun. So these stars are really, really, really close. So you don't see the individual stars. Their light blends together as if they're just one star. Imagine looking at the headlights of a car that's miles away. It's going to look like one light, isn't it? However, these stars can betray their dual nature if we happen to lie in the orbital plane. If you're in the orbital plane and the stars are going like this, then once each period, one star will pass in front of the other star. And so if you measure the light brightness, it does this, dips down, recovers, and dips down again and recovers and repeats. The cycle repeats. One star, then the other star eclipses. And by making measurements of the complete light curve, which takes a few nights to do that, usually, we can study the depths and the shapes of those curves, and we can figure out all sorts of things about them. We can figure out their physical sizes, how big they are. We can infer the masses, actually, from these closed systems. Not directly, but indirectly. On our studies, these stars are so close together, they exchange matter. Matter is lifted from one, tidally distorted, brings it to the other star, and you get mass transfer. And we can see hot spots on one side. There'll be two stars going around, and there's a hot spot right here that you can see, and over here you don't. And it comes back again. We can see that hot spot in the data, and we think that might be a place where the matter is falling onto that other star. We also see dark spots that we think are like sunspots. And we can map their locations and how much of the star is covered. All sorts of clever things we can figure out. Now, the stars I look at are a few hundreds of light years away from us, no big deal. But some of the people I know in the field, they got Hubble Space Telescope time, and they studied some eclipsing binary stars in the Andromeda Galaxy. And they were able to infer their sizes, their temperatures, their masses, all sorts of things. And if the light were created in transit, never leaving those stars, you are seeing a detailed history of events that never happened. That's a problem for me. Because you could just as well say that outside of the solar system, none of the universe exists. It's all just a mirage or holograms or fake images that the Lord set up. And I don't think He works that way. I think when we look at these things, we're really looking at something physical. So I have a real problem with the mature creation idea. And then Barry Setterfield, did you all have him speak here before, I think, or not?
Once.
Once? Okay.
10 years ago.
Yeah, back about 30, it's in the 80s, I guess, maybe in the early 90s, it's been at least 30 years ago, he suggested that the speed of light has been changing. It was near infinite in the early beginning, and it slowed down and reached the value we have today, decayed exponentially. And that caused a lot of attention when it first came out. I remember when it came out, and then people began to look at it. And I've looked at it, and I can see two problems with that. Number one, I don't think the data really support the conclusion. The earliest data point he has is that of the measurement of Romer. And as it turns out, Romer wasn't really trying to measure the speed of light. He was just trying to demonstrate that it was that the speed of light was not infinite. That was a big discussion at the time. But people that can then take his data and interpret it in order to get a measurement of the speed of light. And it turns out it's a bit high from what the modern value is. And then some other people measured it, and it was a bit lower, but still not the modern value, and it got lower, and it continued on up really until recently, in the last, well, it depends on who you ask. But if you plot the data, time versus the speed of light, it does something like this, and it looks like an exponential decay. Except for one thing. In physics and astronomy, you generally put error bars on your measurements, don't you? And if you put error bars on that, you will find out the error bars of Romer's data is huge. The others get a less and less. And once you put the error bars in there, I can draw a horizontal line through that data. I really can. There's a trending thing going on, so I don't think the data really support it. The other aspect is the fact that the speed of light, as you well know, is not some random constant. It depends on the permittivity and permeability of free space. And if you change those by much, you change the structure of matter. And it really has to be a huge change that takes place. Now, I know that Barry has suggested that it's tied into the zero-point energy. He's got this complete theory that kind of explains everything, and I'm just skeptical. I find very dubious about what's really going on there. So I don't like that one either. And then Russ Humphreys came along almost 30 years ago now at the ICC in 1994. I believe he published this thing called the white hole cosmology, and I won't spend much time on it. It's a very popular concept that's still out there. The reason why I won't spend much time on it, because I think many of you probably heard about it before, but beyond that, about a decade ago, people don't know this for the most part, but about a decade ago, Russ Humphreys abandoned that cosmology in favor of a different one. And in the last 5 years, he abandoned that one. So he's now on Humphreys 3.0, I call it. And so the white hole cosmology is dead, at least in Russ's idea. I got 2.0 here, but 3.0 has come out since then. And then John Hartnett was taking the lead of Russ. Russ was taking general relativity and applying what he wanted to do there. And John Hartnett worked with an Israeli-Italian physicist by the name of Carmeli, met with him. And this is a fifth dimension added in there, a speed dimension. And John did some modeling and came up with some interesting results, but he eventually abandoned that as well. So if you talk about Hartnett stuff, well, he wouldn't talk about it anymore because he's become convinced that was wrong. Meanwhile, Jason Lisle came up with what's called the ASC, the Anisotropic Synchrony Convention. And this is the idea that when you measure the speed of light, all you do is measure the two-way speed of light and assume the speed of light's the same in every direction. If you measure a speed of light, typically what you do is just send a beam of light out to a reflector and it comes back, and you measure the time delay between the sent signal and return signal, and you assume that the speed of light is the same in both directions. And when you then divide by twice the distance, you end up with the speed of light. Well, he says, this is a throwaway line I think he heard in the general relativity class in grad school probably, that you have to assign a convention to the speed of light under general relativity, and it gets down to synchronizing clocks and all these sorts of things. Now, I was a little confused by Jason's approach because he actually published his first paper on this more than a decade ago, about 15 years ago, probably 15 years ago, back in the early noughts. And he did it under a pen name of Robert Newton. And he was arguing that there are two conventions of when things happen in astronomy. He used the example of supernova in 1987A. And that happened on a particular date in February of 1987. That's when we witnessed it, we saw it. But it also happened in the Large Magellanic Cloud, which is a satellite galaxy of the Milky Way. And we think that satellite galaxy is about 170,000 light years away from us. So when did it happen? Well, we saw it in February of 1987, or you can say it happened 170,000 years before that, because both answers would be correct. And I think his second paper he wrote a decade later, under assumptions related to general relativity, he said, well, when it comes to general relativity, it doesn't matter which convention you use. You can assume the one-way speed of light is infinite or the two-way speed of light is the same. And I think what he was basically doing was saying if you assume it's infinite one way, it's like saying the supernova happened in 1987. And if you assume the two-way speed of the light is the same, then it happened 170,000 years earlier, and it doesn't really matter. Well, I found that unsettled to think about that way. And the English have an expression, it's too clever by half. And I think that's what's going on here. And recently I've been talking to Phil Dennis, who he's a creationist. He has very deep credentials in quantum mechanics and in general relativity. And he sees a lot of problems with ASC. And he's attempting to take that up with him as well. Keith Wanser's another one who knows a lot more about certain areas of physics than I know, and he has problems with it. So I think there's some reevaluation coming in for ASC, but I think many people out there, the typical lay people, think that Jason's really saying the speed of light one way is infinite towards the Earth, and I don't think he's really saying that at all. it's not clear what is exactly he's saying. So I'm going through these and I find problems with each one of them. And so it got to me thinking, about 20 years ago, got me thinking about this, and it took me a while to formulate this. And what got me thinking in this direction is a review of Creation Week, particularly Day 3 creation, gave me some ideas. And I want to kind of do a review of something here. There are a couple of words used in the creation account of Genesis 1. One of them is the Hebrew word bara, which is translated create. So whenever you see the word create in the Genesis 1 account, you can be sure that the word bara is what's used there. If not, you've got a very poor translation. I've not seen one yet that didn't reflect it that way. And asa is the other word, and that verb means to make. And many people, many creationists argue that bara is always ex nihilo. That is out of nothing. Now, I don't know if you can really get that meaning out of the Hebrew word, but that's the claim many people make. They also say it's to fashion something new. I remember watching a TV show when I was a kid, and I saw on the credits it said created by so-and-so. And I asked my mom, what does that mean to create something? And I think she got across the idea that somebody just came up with their mind. They came up with this. They then made the film. They filmed it on a physical medium. That's making the film, but creating it is just an imagination. I think she was picking up on this distinction we find in the creation account. So they say it's something new, and they say that a saw is to fashion something out of existing material. Now, those are claims that are made about these two verbs. I don't know if these claims are correct or not. I go back and forth on it. It seems to generally be true, but am I absolutely certain they're true? And the answer is, I don't know. But I know one thing for certain. The verb bara is used only to describe the acts of God. From that, it appears that people are incapable of bara creation. We can make things, but we can't bara create like God does. Man can asa. In fact, it's used for man in the Old Testament. So can God. God can make and man can make, but only God can create. And that's the distinction the Hebrew scholars tell me. Now, some people think that the two words are interchangeable, and in some instances, they probably are. However, I disagree with that in every instance. In all the situations, just because there's an interchangeability in some cases, it doesn't guarantee that it's interchangeable in all instances. You have to be very careful about that. And the reason why I say that is because the Genesis creation account, Genesis chapter 1, is a masterful document. It's an incredible document. It has a lot of interesting aspects to it. The more I learn about this from other people who know more about it than I do, the more impressed I am. It's an incredible document. And it appears that the Lord carefully used the terminology that he used. And so when he says that he created something, and on another day he made something, I have to pay attention. Maybe that's important. And what's really important to me is I noticed on the day 4 account, the word create is not used. The word bara is not used. The word asa is made. God made these things. And that suggests to me that maybe that's the kind of process. There's something different from just creation going on there. It's part of creation, but it's a little different process going on there. Now, I have a couple of things I need to throw in here, and I've been guilty of this myself as well. As creation scientists, we often underestimate the role of the miraculous during the creation week. We try to ascribe to things in the creation week certain things we hold today. For instance, when people are trying to explain the light travel time problem, they oftentimes use general relativity, which is our best description of gravity and space and time. Is it true? Is it correct in every aspect? I'm convinced it's not. It's an incomplete theory, but it's the best we have. So when you try to use general relativity to explain the light travel time problem, how light could get here on the creation week, you're invoking modern day science as we understand it. Question. Can you think of anything else in the creation week that we can apply science as we know it to explain? Anything? I can't. You have the appearance of matter and energy where there was none. You have the appearance of life where there was none. You have the appearance of humanity when there was none. You have the appearance of animals where there was none. You see what's going on here? The creation week was incredibly miraculous. And the creation itself violates certain physical principles like the first and second laws of thermodynamics. Matter and energy didn't exist, now it does. That's a violation. You have dirt, and out of that dirt comes plants and animals and man. And that's a violation of the second law of thermodynamics. So I got a newsflash for a lot of people. I don't think physics was working back then, the creation week, the way it works today. I can't think of anything in the creation week that operated by the quote-unquote normal processes today. But yet people want to take the normal processes today, general relativity, and apply it to the light time, travel time problem in day 4. We have a term for that. You know what it's called? It's called uniformitarianism. And when the evolutionists use that principle, we call them out on it. But why don't we call out our own people when they use it? Now, the creation week, obviously physics didn't work the way that it does today, but now it does. When did that start happening? Well, I think it started happening at the end of creation week when God pronounced it was very good. He rests, and the universe is kind of let go at that point. Or is it? If you look at Hebrews 1:3 and also Colossians 1:16 and 17, it speaks of Jesus as the creator, upholding the creation by the power of his word. Upholding the creation by the power of his word. And what he's doing is he's sustaining things, making them work a certain way. And I think it's this approach that made modern science possible 400 years ago in a Protestant worldview. Prior to that, in the Roman Catholic worldview and the pagan worldview, you couldn't have order in the world. It was just chaos. You had flux going all the time. You step in one river, you take your foot out, put the foot back in. It's a different river, isn't it? In the Far East, it's yin and yang. It's always changing. But people begin to realize if God's creator and sustainer of this world, God is a God of order and a God of decrees, maybe he sustains the world in a very consistent manner. And if it's in a consistent manner, that means there's a pattern in the creation. Day by day, God's going to sustain the world in a consistent way, and that then makes it knowable. That's the reason why science, particularly physics, took off in the 17th century in Protestant Europe, because you had people that had a different worldview about things. It's based upon Scripture, again, Colossians 1:16, 17, and Hebrews 1:3. So what I propose happened is that God is creating the world, violating science as we know it today, but hey, the physics as we know today didn't exist yet. And when the creation week ends, God says, okay, this is how it's going to happen from here on out, sustaining. By the way, that sustaining is just as much as a miracle as the creation is, in the fact that I do believe that if God stopped sustaining the world, what would happen? It would cease to exist. And maybe that's what happens in 2 Peter 3 when the end comes. Maybe God stops sustaining and it just collapses in a big flash and roar of raw energy. I don't know. I'm just speculating. But we don't think of that as being a miracle because it's the same thing day in and day out. And so that's that pattern that physicists look for in the world. And it turned out to be a very robust hypothesis. And it's made physics as we know it possible. And physics ever since has been driven by those patterns, looking for those patterns in unity we see in the world. When did the first law come into effect? When did the second law come into effect? Well, I don't know. When did other laws come into effect? We know them. I don't know, but I'm convinced by the end of the week they were there. Maybe they partially came into existence part of the week through, maybe on day 4, maybe on day 5, but certainly end of business on day 6, beginning of day 7, it was in that stasis that we see. So we should not be invoking physics to explain the miraculous, the metaphysics of the creation week. That's an important point for me. That was really liberating for me when I realized this. And I've been guilty of thinking the other way, and now I see it as a problem. Now, the second point I want to make is, can we interpret days of creation, the creation week, in terms of other days? If you see a pattern playing out on one day, might it play a part in another day? And I think that we might be able to do that. And again, I got to see what's going on here. Okay, the day 3 account. And you start there in verse 11, and it says, let the earth bring forth grass. And in verse 12, it says, and the earth, grass and other plants. I put ellipses there. And it says, this is the King James, and the earth brought forth grass. And I put ellipsis point there. And I could not tell you how many times I've read that. Hundreds of times, at least. In all this time, bring forth, brought forth, I thought all I was seeing was a difference in tense. So about 20 years ago, I said, well, what verb is being used there? And I looked it up, and I was quite shocked to find out that 2 different verbs appear in verses 11 and 12. They're not the same verbs. Why would the Lord do that? Well, I think it's for variety. When you're writing, do you ever repeat words in a sentence? Yeah, when you do that, you need to go back and pick a different word the second time, okay? It's just poor writing style. So there's variety coming here. But in order to be variety, it's using the same idea. In this particular case, God commands that these plants grow, and then he says that they grew. So it's the same idea, but you're using 2 different words. But those 2 different words have to have overlapping meanings in order for this to work. They have to be synonyms for each other, and they have to mean basically the same thing. And you can, if they have overlapping meanings and other meanings that don't overlap, you can snip those non-overlapping meanings out and just concentrate on the agreement. Now, the RSV, a reversion of the King James, says put forth in verse 11. The NAS, I think in both of them it says that. In the NAS, the New American Standard, uses sprout. The NIV says to produce. And I looked up the meanings, and it can mean like thrust, shoot, produce, sprout, grow. Those are all very dynamic terms, wouldn't you agree? And when I got done with that study, I sat back in my chair, put my hand on my chin, and I thought about it. And I thought, well, if I would have been there on day 3, went back in a time machine, what would I see? And up to this point, I thought, like everybody else, poof, an oak tree just appeared where there wasn't one, and poof, a palm tree appears where there wasn't one. That's not what the language says. The language says that the stuff grew up out of the ground. So I think if I were there, it would have been like a time-lapse movie, the stuff ripping up out of the ground like this, and branches and little catkins and buds and leaves and fruit, all taking place in less than a day. Maybe minutes, maybe hours, but certainly no more than a day. That's all the time interval we have. Why was that? Well, because if you look at the end of I think it's verse 30 of Genesis 1, all the animals were, and man, they were herbivores. They ate the produce of plants. And everybody would have starved to death if they had to wait for these things to produce fruit. So God rapidly matured these things. He didn't create the trees mature and the other plants mature. He matured them very rapidly in all of this. And again, neither of these words suggest ex nihilo creation. I've been thinking about this wrong for decades. Now, a friend of mine, Eric Hovind, did you have him speak once here? Eric Hovind? No? Eric Hovind did a movie a few years ago called Genesis Paradise Lost. Anybody seen that movie? There was another movie came out that same year called Creation is Genesis History. Y'all seen, I think you're selling that movie back there, actually. So unfortunately, they both came out the same year. I'm the only person that appears in both those films, by the way. But I love the way Eric portrayed this. when you get to day 3 creation, he animates these trees coming up out of the ground. You hear this ripping sound and stuff coming up, and fruit and flowers and leaves. It's incredible. Exactly how I understood it to be. I found out other people had figured this out ahead of me. It took me a long time to get to this point. But incredible how this works. But the point is, it's a rapid process of maturation. And I got to thinking, well, if this is what happened on day 3, it's not ex nihilo, it's not instantaneous, it's a rapid process, a directed process. When I first proposed this, people were accusing me of invoking evolutionary process. No, it's rapid and directed. It's not random and not gradual. How could you confuse that for an evolutionary process? All right, so what I think I'm seeing in the creation week, this is where I take the pattern of one day to other days. I think what we see in the creation week possibly is abnormally rapid process going on. And I've already applied this to the craters in the solar system. I pointed out in the Q&A this afternoon about my ideas about rapid crater formation. It didn't happen all at once. It wasn't instantaneous. It was a rapid process, but it was a directed process, but it was a process. And I think a lot of those craters formed on day 4. And I think on day 5, there's a rapid formation, not only of the moon and the planets, but the sun and the stars and other things like galaxies. And then in order to see them, I believe there was a rapid extension, if you will, or that God brought forth that light, just as he brought forth the light from, just as he brought forth the plants out of the ground on day 3, I think God brought forth that light. And it had to get there at least by the end of day 6, but I suggest that since it was pronounced good at the end of day 4, it almost certainly was by the end of day 4, a very rapid process. This is consistent with the pattern we see. The text doesn't say this, but I'm saying you can see the text in other days have a process like this. If God is following a similar pattern on other days, then this is a reasonable inference of what might have happened. I'm going to say might because I am speculating a bit here. I'm conjecturing. But I'm arguing that it's consistent with the patterns we see on other days. Now, some people would say, well, this is like the heavens being stretched. But I disagree. Because the stretching of the heavens, mentioned explicitly 11 times in the Old Testament, I believe is a better fit to the event that happened on day 2. Not on day 4. I'm not looking for a day 4 stretching the heavens. I think it's a different process. Plus, it's not stretching the heavens at all. It's just bringing the light forth very quickly on day 4. And again, I apologize for the way this is acting up on me. All right, I want to compare it to other solutions. The white hole cosmology, I'm looking at the miraculous, and the white hole would be a physical mechanism. Back when I was developing this idea 2 decades ago, I was still at the university, and word had gotten out I was working on something. I was cogitating, and I hadn't written it up yet. I wouldn't write it up for a while yet. But Russ Humphreys and I are good friends, and Russ got wind of it, so he wanted to talk to me about it. So he called me in the office one day, and I sat there on the phone 20 minutes, like I have now, explaining what I'm talking about. When I got done, Russ was still in his 1.0, white hole cosmology. And he said, well, Danny, I have a physical mechanism for that. And I said, but Russ, you don't understand. I'm not looking for a physical mechanism. You might as well tell me you've got a physical mechanism for the creation of life, or a physical mechanism for the appearance of light, and these, or maybe a physical mechanism for the virgin birth or resurrection. All of those are miracles. So why are you trying to invoke a physical, non-miraculous event and process on day 4? Mature creation, well, in my understanding, perhaps I could call it matured creation. In mature creation, the light is created in transit as if it left these objects but never did, with information about processes that never happened. With mine, it actually left. I think when I look at the Andromeda Galaxy, I'm looking at light that actually left that galaxy, not millions of years ago, but in the last 6,000 years. The light was rapidly brought to me. The other considerations I want to point out, and I've been asked this question by people who didn't see this particular slide. I didn't really address it sometimes when I republish it, but it seems to me that if you go from the miraculous of day 4 and creation week in general, and you now go into the stasis that's instituted at the beginning of day 7, there's some sort of transition, wouldn't there be, between the two? And people have asked me, well, what kind of signature would there be in the light at that point? And I haven't a clue. Because one's miraculous and one's not. How do you do a physical understanding of a miraculous event? I think there should have been a transition of some sort, but I don't know what that transition would look like. That's one problem I have, and it bothers me. I have to admit that. I think, and I sort of mentioned this earlier today, but I'll mention it again. As a result of this, I think we're seeing the universe in something close to real time. When I see the Andromeda Galaxy, I'm seeing 6,200-year light, 6,000-year-old light coming from that thing. When I look at the pair of galaxies I showed in my title slide, it's 300 million light years away, but I'm looking at light that left that about 6,000 years ago. When I look at if I could look at a quasar that's 3 billion light years away, I haven't, but if I did, then I would be looking at light that left that thing about 6,000 years ago. Now, 6,000 years is not a lot. It's a pretty long time ago to me and you, but when you compare that to billions of light years, that's pretty close to real time, isn't it? So it's something close to real time. And again, this would bring up questions like I mentioned in the Q&A this afternoon. Why did God put all the quasars at great distance? I don't know. That's a problem I think we need to explain within this explanation. And then some people want to say, well, wait a minute, the curse hasn't happened yet, so how can you have supernovae taking place? Well, if you read the curse very carefully in chapter 3, it doesn't say anything about the effects on stars, does it? It says it cursed the ground for Adam's sake. It cursed the serpent for what Satan did with the serpent. It cursed the woman's relationship to the man and her body as well. But the curse seems to be affected with this earth. Now, the taint of man's sin, which is a little different concept, does affect the cosmos, according to Romans chapter 8. But we need to be very careful that we don't read too much into that. Now, does the future destruction of the heavens include the astronomical heavens? And I believe it does. 2 Peter chapter 3 mentions that, the new heaven and a new earth. It's more specific there, but John in the book of Revelation 21 talks about a new heaven and a new earth. It gives no details. And even Isaiah chapters 65 and 66 speaks of a new heaven and a new earth. But Peter in 2 Peter chapter 3 gives more details about the destruction of this. And I think it does affect all of this. Interestingly enough, again, I don't want to harp on it too much, but Henry Morris and John Whitcomb both believed that the destruction of the heavens was merely the atmospheric heavens, not the astronomical heavens. And I disagree with them on that point as well. So, anyway, that's basically my talk. I have written a couple of books on this issue. One is called The Created Cosmos. It's in English, probably not available here. You'd have to pay an exorbitant shipping cost on getting it here. Why don't you just come to the Ark Encounter and the Creation Museum. Did I mention those, by the way? And you can buy them in the bookstore and take them home with you. Save the shipping costs. So, are there any questions for me?